Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and let's talk about the HE1000SE and the HE1000 version 2 Stealth Edition. So yes, what I've got in front of me here today are the two current versions of the HE1000. We've got the HE1000SE, which is in the darker wood here, and that's really the only thing that visually separates the two, is the dark timber on the HE1000SE versus the lighter timber on the HE1000 version 2 Stealth Edition. There's also a brown leather headband on the regular HE1000 versus a black one on the SE. And then other than that, there is printing that says HE1000SE on this one and just HE1000 on this one. And so that's actually how I'm going to refer to these throughout this review. If I'm talking HE1000, it means I'm talking about the HE1000 version 2 Stealth Edition. If I say HE1000SE, then it's obviously the Special Edition. To help differentiate these slightly, there is also a different price between the two. So the SE version that I've got here, the darker one, these come in at $3,500 US. But then there's a big drop down to the HE1000 version 2 Stealth Edition. And essentially what's happened is the Stealth version has just carried on from the V2. So on the HiFiMan website, on Amazon, you'll see these listed as the HE1000. What they actually are though is an update of the version 2, but HiFiMan still consider them the version 2, just the version 2 Stealth. And it starts to get really confusing because now we're going to have like an HE1000 V2 SE Stealth Edition, and we're going to have the HE1000 SE, which I think is actually Special Edition, but these also use stealth magnets. So things are getting really, really confusing. When I chatted to my contact at HiFiMan, what they explained was that the HE1000 version 2 Stealth Edition needed to retain exactly the same name because otherwise they drop all the way back down to the bottom of things like Amazon rankings because they have to build it back up as if it's a brand new product. When in reality it is an incremental change, and therefore they wanted to maintain the exact same position in the rankings and therefore hopefully get better sales and exposure. And of course you could argue that it's not the same product and therefore it's misleading. I'll leave that up to you. I personally don't think there's anything wrong with it because it's a great product, as we'll talk about shortly. Unfortunately, I don't have the original version 2, the non-stealth version here to compare, so I can't tell you how much of a difference it is. But what I can tell you is how it compares to the SE, how it compares to the Arya, and how the SE compares to the Meze Elite, which are somewhat close in price. So let's get into all of that now and talk about these wonderful headphones. I covered off in the B-roll, as I've started to do these days, some of the specs about these, things like the impedance and the sensitivity. The one step further that I want to take it though is that both of these headphones are relatively easy to drive. The HE1000s are a little bit more difficult than the Special Editions, but they're not vastly difficult to drive. You can still run them from a good dongle, any desktop device at all, they're not difficult. And in fact, they're one of the headphones I used in my recent testing of the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 tube amplifier, and that's a very, very low power amp in the scheme of things, but it had no problems with either of these models. So yes, they're not the most easy to drive headphone, but they're not even the most difficult headphone in HiFiMan's range under the Susvara. That award would go to the HE400SE, so these aren't even as difficult as the HE400s. So don't be worried about needing a power plant to drive either of these. That's one of the beauties of them, is you can drive them from pretty much anything. Of course, at this level of performance, when we're talking sort of $2,000 and $3,500, that's where you are going to want to start spending money on a decent source chain, but that's more about getting high quality power, not lots and lots of power. And I just realized that in the conversation about how the HE1000 version 2 Stealth Edition was just picking up seamlessly from the original HE1000, what I didn't mention was the pricing. So if you have a look on the HiFiMan website, the HE1000 is listed as a $2,999 headphone, but marked down to $1,999. I thought maybe that was a clearance pricing until they went from the original V2 to the Stealth Edition V2. But as it turns out, in talking to my contact at HiFiMan, it's going to stay at that $1,999 price point. So it's quite a jump between these two, and the fact that they both hold the HE1000 name, with just obviously the SE here against the version 2 and the version 2 Stealth over here, it made me think they should have performed similarly, and I was surprised at the price difference. But as I'll talk about in a minute, there are a lot of things separating these in terms of their sonic performance, and it's not to say that one is clearly better or worse than the other, but there is a reason that you might spend more on the SE, and at the same time, you might be stoked to find out that the version 2 Stealth, is actually better for you. So we'll break all that down in a moment, but before we get there, a couple of final things I want to mention. In terms of the general design of both headphones, they are almost identical on the outside. As I've already said, you've got the colour difference of the timber and the leather headbands. They both use 3.5mm inputs, but when you do open the boxes, you're getting quite different cables. The HE1000SE uses the old, horrible catheter-style cables that many of us have joked about before, and then the HE1000 V2 Stealth Edition uses newer, black insulated cables, which are nicer to interact with. I even compare them sonically. I don't really care for either of the cables from an ergonomics point of view, and I just automatically go and reach for some of the other cables I've got here. Over the years, as many of you will have, I've collected a number of different cables. I've got Litz cables, I've got quality copper stranded cables, and I just use whichever ones I think are best fitted for the headphones. And so what I'd say is that the cables that come with the version 2 are very serviceable from an ergonomic point of view, but I always tend to lean towards buying a better quality cable for this type of headphone at this level of performance. And that's partly for ergonomics and also because I do feel you can get a little bit better performance with a slightly better cable. Moving beyond the cables though, if we start to talk about what's going on inside the headphones, both headphones now use the nanometer diaphragms. That means it's a very, very lightweight and theoretically very responsive diaphragm. That's the bit that moves the air. And now both of them are also using stealth magnets. But what I noticed when I opened up these by taking off the pads from both is that they have quite different magnet structures. And that's probably partly going to be influencing how they sound, which is quite different from one another. I'll talk about that in a moment. But it was interesting to see that the driver on the HE1000 is visually more obscured than it is on the HE1000SE. Now you might immediately think that that will make the HE1000SE the brighter headphone, and you'd be wrong. So it's clearly not stopping all the treble getting through, but it is a different layout on the HE1000 compared to the HE1000SE. And so with that said, let's jump into sound now and talk about how these compare to each other and then how they compare to some other headphones. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. The most immediately obvious difference between the two is that they do have a slightly different tonal character. The HE1000SE is a slightly smoother, slightly darker sound than the HE1000 V2, but I wouldn't describe it at all as a dark overall tuning. It's just not got as much treble as the HE1000 V2. And again, I apologise, I'm switching back and forth between HE1000, HE1000 V2, HE1000 V2 Stealth. Throughout this entire review, I am referring only to the HE1000 version 2 Stealth Edition, or the SE, which is always going to be clear because I'm going to say SE. So apologies that I'm jumping around. As I said before, the naming is getting very confusing by having all these models going on. So the HE1000 version is a brighter tuned headphone. That does mean that it throws a sense of a slightly larger, wider soundstage. Whereas the SE does bring everything in a little bit more. It kind of focuses you more on the central image, the central vocals, etc. And what it also does with the SE is it gives you more of a sense of a spherical soundstage. As I went back and forth between the two, the HE1000 gives you more left-right width, but not as much sense of depth. I found that the SE was giving me more sense of depth, less sense of width, but the end result was a more spherical soundstage, which to me is a bit more natural, but I know that others like the width, and so it's going to come down to your preferences. Overall, as I went back and forth time and time again, the things that stood out to me was that I think technically they're a very similar level of performance. So in terms of things like detail retrieval, resolution, what I'd call the speed of the driver, so how fast it responds to the notes, how quickly things decay, all of those things, they both sound like snappy and responsive headphones. So where the difference really comes in is that tuning difference, and that plays out in terms of both the overall tonal signature or the sound signature of these, as well as some of the character in terms of things like the soundstage presentation, the imaging, etc. And they're not vastly different. You can hear that they've kind of been built on the same foundation, but there are a few things that separate them. Because they are quite similar, it took me a number of tracks to really get my head around which one I preferred, what each one was doing well versus not so well in comparison. And so let me talk you through a few specific tracks. These are just tracks that came on as I shuffled through my whole collection, and they were tracks that gave me different senses of what was going on in these headphones. The first track was Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen, and this was where I started to hear that the SE was richer and fuller with a bit less treble overall. The HE1000s initially came across as a bit more resolving and a bit more detailed, but that's because of the extra treble, and that treble did bite sometimes. Occasionally on Bohemian Rhapsody, which isn't the best recording ever, the HE1000s got just a little bit aggressive in the top end, whereas the SEs remained smooth but still very detailed throughout. I felt like the SEs focused me more on things like the instruments and the vocals, and when I say instruments, things like guitar, bass, etc. Whereas the treble from the HE1000s was pulling me more to think about the percussion, so the snares, the cymbals, the high frequency sounds. And personally, I'm someone that when I listen to music, I'm looking mostly for the mid-range. Not that I want a heavily mid-range focused sound, but I do want a sound that really lets me home in on things like the vocal qualities, any instrumental solos, the main focus of the music. Whereas with the HE1000s, it was distracting me away from that a little bit with extra treble. Now I should mention at this point that most of my testing for this was done with the Chord Hugo TT2, and that's because it's a very neutral, very clean delivery. But I did also try these on various other tube amps. I had things like the new Shit Magni Plus and the Magni Heretic here. That review's coming soon, by the way. I've tried them with the HiFiMan EF400, which by the way is a fantastic match for both of them. And so across a whole lot of different headphone amps, I did get a good sense of what they were doing, but most of what I'm talking about here is coming from the TT2. And I share that specifically because it means if you like what I'm saying about the version 2, the version 2 SE, but you want to tame it a little bit, then you can always use a slightly warmer, richer sounding amplifier. And of course in reverse, you can take the SE and give it a bit more sparkle and brightness with a more analytical amplifier. Not that I think either headphone particularly needs a huge amount of tonal adjustment, but it's there should you want to. Moving on from Bohemian Rhapsody, the next track that I moved on to was Everlasting Friend by Blue October. And again, the SE brought me into the vocals really nicely. It had the vocals front and center, and I could really engage with the lyrics. The percussion from the SEs was still sparkly and bright, so it's not like they're a dark headphone, it's not like they're overly muddy or anything like that, they're just not as bright and sparkly and energetic as something like the HE1000. And in fact, when I moved over to the HE1000, even though they normally actually require more volume to get the same level of output, I actually needed to pull back the volume a bit because the treble was just a bit too bitey for me from them. And so overall, my total sound pressure level would have been lower from the HE1000s, but I was still finding the treble just that little bit aggressive for me on this recording. What the HE1000 version 2 Stealth did really well here though, was it brought a bit of extra articulation, a bit of extra texture into things like the vocals. So it wasn't quite as smooth, it did have a bit more kind of clarity, texture, whatever word you want to put to it, but at the same time it was becoming harder to kind of feel the groove of the music because everything was focused in that upper end. I feel like the HE1000 SE balances the richness, the warmth, the bass, the mid-range, the treble, all a little bit better, whereas the HE1000, the version 2 Stealth, just takes me a little bit more always towards focusing on the treble. It's got excellent bass extension and presence, but it's just overshadowed a bit by that treble. And so that led me to one more test that I really wanted to try with both of them, and that was to put some classical music through them. One of the tracks I landed on was Cantabile in D, and that's by Wildefrang and Michael Liffitz. And listening to this track, which is a violin solo and piano accompaniment, as I went back and forth between the two, both sounded fantastic once again, but to me, having come from actually being a violin and viola player myself, it was the HE1000 SE that to me sounded the most like I was holding a violin and playing it. So to me, it was the more natural sound coming out of the SE. Things were just a little bit brittle, a little bit emphasized in the top end when coming from the HE1000. And that doesn't again mean that everybody should rush out and buy the SE and ignore the HE1000 version 2 Stealth. It just means you need to be aware of what your personal tastes are in music. If you are looking for what I think is a more tonally accurate, slightly smoother presentation, then that's where I do think the SE is better. But if you enjoy that extra bit of emphasis and energy and excitement in the sound from the treble, then that's where the HE1000 could be good for you. So both are excellent, but you need to decide what your preferences and what your tastes are, and possibly what your source chain is too. If you've got a richer, darker source chain, or you like using sort of warmer, smoother tube amps, and therefore you want a bit more energy coming from your headphones, then the HE1000 would be great. So take that into account, think about what suits you. Either headphone is a really great choice, and for the $1,500 difference, it's very hard to go past the HE1000 in many ways, but I think if it was me, I'd still buy the HE1000SE. I do think it's worth the extra money, because yes, you can try an EQ headphones, but you're never going to get quite the same character between them, even with some EQ. There are differences in the way they deliver the sound, the different magnet structures are going to change the way the diaphragm's moving, and so take all that into account when you're making your decisions. But something else you might want to take into account while you're making your decisions are the other options around about the same prices. One of the things that really struck me when I did my measurements for these headphones was how closely they aligned with other headphones in the HiFiMan stable. And what I mean by that is the general shape of the frequency response curves look very similar if you compare the HE1000 to the HiFiMan Arya Stealth, and then if you compare the HE1000SE to the HiFiMan Susvara. There are obvious differences between them. They're not trying to make exactly the same headphone at two levels, but you can see that the HE1000 is more akin to the HiFiMan Arya, and the HE1000SE is more akin to the Susvara. And I think that's a really good way to think about this going forward. If you heard the Arya and you love it, then the HE1000 is going to be a good fit. If you heard the Susvara and you love it, the HE1000SE is kind of similar. It's probably a bit more different from the Susvara than, say, the HE1000 is from the Arya, but it gives you a starting point to think about. Likewise, if you've heard the Arya and it was too bright for you, then the HE1000 probably isn't the best option. The HE1000SE is probably a better choice. And so to help clarify that further, let me now compare the HE1000, this again being the V2 Stealth version, let me compare that to the HiFiMan Arya Stealth version. One of the tracks I used for this comparison was Right Place, Wrong Time by Dr. John. And I found that much like I've talked about already with the HE1000, the Arya focused me a little bit too much on some of the percussion in this track. I was drawn to things like the cymbals, and instead I should have been more focused on things like the vocals. Moving from the Arya over to the HE1000, and I felt like it was even slightly more aggressive again. What that means is it also opens up the sound more, it gives you more sense of space, more texture, more clarity, but it does come at the cost of just a little bit more aggression. So if you've got the Aryas already or you've heard them and you find that they're kind of right on the edge for you of having just the right amount of treble, maybe borderline too much, then going to the HE1000s could be a step too far. But if you love the Aryas and you want more of the same, then the HE1000s could be a really great step, particularly when at the moment and maybe forevermore, there's only about $400 or $500 difference between them. And so basically I'd sum the two of them up, that being the HE1000 and the Arya, as being essentially the same sort of headphone tuning, but with the technicalities and a little bit more aggression going to the HE1000. It's a little bit like an Arya with just a dash of steroids. It's not a massive change going between them, but there is definitely an increase in technicalities, in detail, resolution, etc., and also in aggression just by a small step. When I quickly checked the HE1000SE against the Arya, what I found was that it helped to smooth things out a little bit. It pulled some of the bite out, it balanced off the tonality a little bit better, where I wasn't being drawn to focus on the percussion, and it was still clearly a more technically capable headphone. The HE1000SE still gives you more sense of space, more sense of texture, resolution, detail, etc., but it does it in a smoother way. And so for me, I personally think the HE1000SE is the better step up from the Arya. I know it's a bigger jump, but I also think it's a better overall tuning of headphone, but that's based on my preferences. As I said before, if you love the Aryas, you're probably going to love the HE1000 as well. Something else that I noticed as I listened to the HE1000SE again versus the Arya, and this could be a bit of a deciding factor for you, is that the difference in tuning, in addition to taking away some of that emphasis on things like the treble, the different balance of the frequencies meant that when you hear a sound like there's a baritone sax in Right Place, Wrong Time, that baritone sax was able to pop out of the mix a bit more. I was able to hear it more clearly, everything from the bass registers all the way through to treble, I was able to pick everything out better with the SE than I could with either the Arya or the HE1000. Because these two, that being the Arya and the HE1000, tend to skew everything into the treble, it does mask some of what's going on in the lower frequencies. So if you are someone like me and you want to hear the full instrumentation, that's where I think the better balanced tonality of the HE1000SE is a better choice. But again, it's going to come down to personal preference. And speaking of personal preference, I think if I was to sum this all up, that being the HE1000SE, the HE1000 and the Arya, I would actually rank them in terms of enjoyment, not technicalities, but just enjoyment. I would reach for the HE1000SE first. I'd actually reach for the Arya second, because I think it's just tonally a little bit better. And then the HE1000 version 2 Stealth would be my third choice. All three are fantastic headphones. If you gave me only one of them and said that's the only headphone forever, I'd still be happy. But I would rank the SE first, the Arya second, and the version 2 Stealth edition of the HE1000 as my third option in terms of order of preference for just pure listening enjoyment. In terms of technicalities, it's hard to say whether I'd choose the HE1000SE or the HE1000 first. They're both technically very, very strong, but I do consistently reach for the SE more. And so speaking of the SE and how much I like it, the other thing I wanted to touch on, and I don't have the Susvara here unfortunately to do a side-by-side, I ended up selling my Susvaras. But what I've been thinking about as I've listened to the HE1000SE is that I think in some ways for me personally, it's a better tuned version of the Susvara, but that different tuning also comes with a technical drop-off. So the Susvara is still technically superior if you want the ultimate kind of speed of driver, and what I mean by that is the way it's able to attack transients, the way if a guitar string is plucked, you can almost feel the energy of the pluck through the Susvara. Those things are still absolutely the party piece for the Susvara, and the HE1000SE doesn't do that. What the HE1000SE does do though is give you a bit more warmth and a bit more soul, and that was ultimately the reason that I let the Susvaras go, was that I didn't reach for them often enough because I didn't enjoy them enough. I respect them as probably the best headphone on the planet from a technical point of view, but they weren't a headphone that I felt I wanted to listen to regularly. They were more a headphone that I reached for when I wanted to hear the technical capabilities from a piece of gear, if I wanted to hear the technical quality of a recording, not because I thought I'm really going to enjoy listening to this. Whereas with the HE1000SE, I can put them on purely for enjoyment. Yes, they're not as technically strong as the Susvara, but they are incredibly enjoyable. And that probably leads me now to the headphone that's stuck around that I do listen to all the time for enjoyment, and that's the Meze Elite. The Meze Elite costs about $4,000 versus $3,500 for the HE1000SE, and so it seemed like a really good test case to put the Elite up against the HE1000SE. My first expectation was that the Elites were going to be way ahead of the SE in terms of sound quality, and so I was interested to see if that played out. Before I get to the sound quality though, I should mention that the build quality of the HE1000SE and the HE1000s, they're good, they're solid, they're fine, the comfort is quite strong too, but they're nowhere near the level of the Meze Elites. So that extra $500, if you were just spending that on comfort and the look and the feel of the Meze Elites, I think that's almost worth it, because these are nice and they're comfortable, but they're nowhere near the engineering marvel that I find all the Meze headphones to be. But putting aside the design and the aesthetics, the HE1000SE versus the Meze Elite was a really interesting comparison for me. And that's because what I found was that the SE gets very, very close to the Meze Elite on pure sound quality, but they both do it differently. To me, the Elite still has a slight edge in terms of the layering of the sound and the overall size and space in the soundstage, but it's doing it with a few sort of tuning tricks. One of the things that Mezes do really nicely is they pull back on certain frequencies and boost others to help space out the soundstage, to help layer the sound. There's probably also some qualities of the actual driver and how it performs that are a part of that too, so it's not just about frequency response. But when you put the two side by side, there's a delicacy to the way the Meze Elite places all the sounds in space that's really, really enjoyable. And I did miss that from the HE1000SE. But on the flip side, with the HE1000SE, there was a sense of accuracy in the tonality that I think the Meze Elite lacks a little bit. The Meze Elite pulls out some of the upper mid-range, I think, to create that sense of space and distance between you and the music, and the HE1000SE doesn't do that as much, which means that at times it can sound more tonally accurate. I don't think either headphone sounds inaccurate ever, but I do think sometimes when I put the HE1000SE on, it reminded me that there's a certain tonality, there's a certain colour to the sound of the Elites. It's a colour that I love, but I don't know that it's entirely accurate when compared to something like the HE1000SE. And if you saw my recent roundup of all the flagship headphones, where I looked at the Elites, I looked at the LCD5s, I had the Susvaras there, and also the DCA Expanse, I said in there that the DCA Expanse was really strong for me on tonality, and I came very, very close to keeping the Expanse and buying a pair, but in the end I sent them back because they weren't quite right for me, and I think in many ways the HE1000SE might be filling that gap. I'm not saying it's exactly the same as the DCA Expanse, they've got their own character and differences, but I find the tonality of the HE1000SE to be very natural and very pleasing to listen to. And so how I'd sum the two of them up is that I find the Meze Elites to be a little bit warmer, a little bit richer, and a bit more mid-range focused, whereas the HE1000SE brings a bit more sparkle and brightness and attack, but both of them do what they do in ways that are thoroughly enjoyable to listen to. They're both headphones that I can put on and both from a comfort and a sonic point of view literally wear all day and not regret a moment of my listening, either from comfort or from listening fatigue. So they're both an excellent choice. The fact that you can get these for $500 less than the Elites means that for some people, this is all you're ever going to need, being the HE1000SE. And so to wrap all this up now, what I would say is that if you are looking for a flagship level experience, but you don't want to go as far as the Susvara, maybe you don't want to have a power station to drive them, maybe you don't want to spend the full price tag on them, I think the HE1000SE is a really great choice. It's giving you sound that's coming close, but also being slightly different from the Meze Elites, and they're really easy to drive from anything you want. Having said that, if you find headphones like the Elites, or if you try the HE1000SE and you find them a bit too smooth, maybe not quite as sparkly as you'd like, then that's where I think the HE1000 is a great choice. And as I said before, if you're a fan of the HiFiMan Arya Stealth Edition, the HE1000 version 2 Stealth just takes that one step further. It is a little bit more energetic and therefore a bit more kind of fatiguing at times potentially, but it takes everything that the Aryas do well and just ups them another level. More separation, more technicalities, more texture, and a little bit more aggression. If you were choosing between one of the HE1000 variants, I do think the SE is the better tonally balanced headphone. But for those that love treble, love detail, love texture, then you can save yourself $1,500 and still get an amazing headphone with the HE1000 version 2 Stealth. And so just to finally wrap this up, I want to clarify for you, if you are looking to pick up either of these headphones, this one, the smoother, kind of more tonally balanced one in my opinion, is the HE1000SE. It should be listed for about $3,500 wherever you're looking for it. And then if you go over to the HE1000, it is going to be listed just as the HE1000. You may want to check with the retailer to make sure you're getting a stealth version if you're buying it based on this review, because I've only been talking about the HE1000 Stealth Magnet Edition in this review. So I can't comment on how it compares to the regular HE1000 V2. All I can talk about is how the Stealth Magnet version compares to the Arya and the SE. So make sure if you are going to buy yourself a pair of HE1000s that you're getting the Stealth Magnet Edition if you're basing it on this review. As always, I hope you found the review useful. Hopefully it's helped to clarify the differences, the benefits of these different models. And as always, if you have found the video useful, helpful, or enjoyable, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button, consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.